He is our history professor. I have to read this. He has quite a long, distinguished history. His family, I guess, came over from Cuba. He was born here. But that's his area of specialty. And he has his PhD in history from Florida State University. And he's the author of several books about Cuban exiles. Fleeing Castro, Operation Pedro Pan, and the Cuban Children's Program, Bay of Pigs, An Oral History of Brigade 2506, the Cuban Revolution, Years of Promise, the Unbroken Circle series, historical fiction, I think that's a trilogy, and Freedom of Trade, and a new one on Freedom Shores to be released in November. He is a frequent figure on the national scene, and he's done international interviews as well. The national scene, he's been on NPR, C-SPAN, Book TV, CNN, Fox News, War Stories with Oliver North, numerous radio programs, and again, a number of European publications. So Middlesex is very blessed to have a figure of such prominence. Now Victor is going to give us the history.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Anna, and the college for hosting this, and thank you all for being here. And of course, thank you especially Judith for pulling all this together. When Judith called me, I think it was in the summer, and I was in the throes of editing a book that I needed to finish. And I'm looking at my computer, and my hand on one hand on the computer, the other one holding the phone. And she said, "We're having this, can you do it?" I'm like, and I didn't know what she said. And I'm like, yeah. I was like, I better find out what this is all about. It sounded good when I did pick up, right, but I wasn't sure. But as the date approached and I paid more attention to what I had agreed to do, it came into more focus, and I began to see what a true honor it was to be invited to speak at the 200th anniversary of the Star-Spangled Banner. Wow, it is a great honor. So, as a history guy, I mean, it was kind of open what I would talk about. But I often say, if you want to understand the concept, tell the story, right? If you want to, understand, especially a historical concept, don't explain the concept, and don't give a definition of the context of the concept. Tell the story. Tell the story, and then people will understand it, right? And don't tell them it's significant because of this, but they won't get it unless you tell them the story. But as we know, the Star-Spangled Banner was a byproduct of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is maybe our most unusual war. It's unusual because the causes are very muddled and disconnected. The combination of grievances against the British that went back for years, mixed with territorial ambition on our part, it's not a neat package. I think of the different things that I teach, maybe the causes of the War of 1812 are the most difficult, because there's no clear line. This happened, this happened, this happened, and we went to war. When we declared war on Britain, Great Britain at that moment was in a life or death struggle against Napoleon. You can imagine the British, we got to fight these people now too. We're fighting against Napoleon. They were fighting mostly in Spain at that moment. Most of the issues had become moot points by the time war was declared. And the biggest battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought after the peace treaty had already been signed. Except nobody here knew, because it took several weeks to get across the Atlantic Ocean back then, and there was no transatlantic cable. But in spite of those unusual characteristics, it was in effect a second war of independence. There was a substantial British threat to the north, and there was. Keep in mind that the European powers at this time were not powers 3,000 miles away. These were powers that still had empires in the Americas. The British were in Canada. The Spanish were immediately to the west and to the south in Florida, and in the west of the Louisiana Purchase. But there were a lot of tests. This war, sometimes we downplay the importance of this war. It was a test to see if the new generation of leaders were up to the task. By this time, a lot of the generation that had founded the country, the George Washingtons and Jeffersons and Hamiltons, had already passed from history. And now there was a new generation, the Andrew Jacksons, Henry Clays, John C. Calhouns, Would they be up to the task of continuing this experiment? This was the first big test. It will test if independence a generation earlier was a historical fluke, an accident, a lucky shot, which a lot of people considered it to be, an accident of history. It'll test the resilience of our form of government, which is a republic. And there wasn't a whole lot of faith in republics at this time, especially in the Western world. France had tried their hand at a republic in the early 1890s, and less than 10 years later, around 10 years later, when Napoleon put the crown on his own head, that ended the first French Republic. And so there wasn't a whole lot of faith that republics will actually work, so it was still very much an experiment. Will this, this war put that to the test? It'll test if our leaders and our nation could withstand territorial challenges, and like we said, there were a lot of hungry European powers surrounding us at that time. The European powers were not 3,000 miles away. They were here. And it would also test if we deserve to be independent and free, and all these tests. And there was also the issue that we can't leave out, and that was a challenge placed by Americans themselves. There were still people trying to figure out, and people still trying to decide, what are we? Are we a single nation? Are we a loose collection of states that each have our own self-interest and we just cooperate on certain matters? Already, that issue was the most divisive in the country. Are we a single nation, or are we a collection of states? And is there any basis, any tangible basis, any spiritual basis to even look at ourselves as a single country? And that was a very, very difficult issue, considering that so much of the population were in far-flung places in the West, completely disconnected from the country. Anyway, to bring it into context, at first, during the war, Great Britain was mostly focused on Napoleon. They had a lot the British had a lot on their plate. And the efforts against the Americans were mostly protecting Canada, because there were U.S. invasions into Canada, which they were able to hold off. They did raid and capture settlements along the Chesapeake and burn some to the ground. But the fighting was sporadic. But in 1814, Napoleon's finally defeated. I know, in 1815, Napoleon's going to escape from Elba and come back for his famous 100 Days. But he was all but defeated, sent into exile at Elba, and the British could now focus on this war. So in 1814, in July, battle-seasoned British troops, fresh from the war in Europe, are sent to the United States, and led by a commander, I should point out, who had an absolute pathological hatred for all things American. He'd lost relatives in the War of Independence and detested the United States and everything it stood for. Anyway, on August 19th, 1814, 5,000 British troops land south of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was virtually undefended. The Secretary of War at the time convinced the President, Madison, don't worry about Washington. They don't care about Washington. There's nothing in Washington, which was true. Watch Baltimore. They're going to hit Baltimore. Don't worry about Washington. Unfortunately, they were very interested in Washington because of its symbolic value. And so, once it became clear that the British were near Washington, panic broke out in Washington. The danger was so clear that the major, and this has always impressed me, the major national documents were removed. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence were all removed and taken out of Washington because there was no way that they were going to stop them from taking the city. People began to flee. All the government officials, from the president on down, got on horses and took off. There's going to be a small battle 6 miles from Washington with a small American force they were able to muster, and the Americans were crushed and went on a wild stampede sort of retreat out of there. By this time, virtually all of Washington had emptied out. One of the last people to leave, this is a curious fact of the war, was Dolly Madison, the First Lady. And Dolly Madison was maybe the most popular First Lady ever, but she stayed behind to save the portrait of George Washington that hung in the Executive Mansion. And it's the famous one. We've all seen it. You go online and see which one she saved. And once she saw the British were coming in, she ordered the frame to be broken, the canvas to be taken, and she was one of the last ones to leave. Anyway, the British, of course, easily took Washington. In retaliation for the Americans burning down the Canadian Parliament earlier during the U.S. invasion of Canada. They burned down the U.S. Capitol. They burned down what today we call the White House, which was called the Executive Mansion back then, and then moved on and burned other buildings. But there was a small miracle.
Yeah.
The next day, there was a hurricane, and it passed right over Washington. And it doused the flames. Not that the flames didn't do damage, they did a lot of damage, but it doused the flames. And then a tornado came and cut right across the British troops and killed more British soldiers than the battle had the previous day. And it decimated them. Trees were falling on them, they had nowhere to hide. So I don't know if it was luck or Providence or what. But anyway, now it was clear. Baltimore's in the crosshairs. Baltimore they're going to take. Baltimore was valuable. Baltimore was a major port city. It was also where there were a lot of privateers who were doing a lot of damage to the British trade. And everyone mobilized to defend the city. The city pulls together. Whatever conflicts there are of any nature fade. A pending invasion will do that. If you want a community to pull together, tell them there's an army coming to invade. Whatever problems they have will fall by the wayside. An older general, Samuel Smith, from the War of Independence, is put in charge. The people in Washington, who just made those great decisions that resulted in the capture of Washington, was trying to tell him what to do, and he said, "I'm not listening to you. I'm going to do what I want," and he did. And several tasks were carried out very quickly. The entire community pulled together, the ultimate community effort to build earthen breastworks outside of Baltimore, which everybody went out and began to dig. George Armistead, meanwhile, 38-year-old Army major, was put in charge of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry literally sticks out into the water, like on a little peninsula. I'm not very good at these geographic terms, right? And it's near the end, and it protects. It's the fort that protects access to Baltimore. Armistead asks the merchants of Baltimore, of which there were many, to sail their ships into the bay. And there was one mouth leading into the bay. And he asked them to sail right into that mouth and sink their ships. Sink your ships, your private property, to create a barrier, right? Almost like a reef, so that the British can't get their ship. And you know what? They went out and they did it. Can you imagine it? Took the whole property and sank it, right? That's, I think a great reflection of the spirit that existed in Baltimore at this time. Meanwhile, he ordered 2 flags to be built, and he ordered them from Mary Pickersgill, London flag maker. One, a normal size flag, which they call the storm flag. But he also wanted a garrison flag. He wanted the biggest flag in the United States. And so Ms. Pickersgill, along with 7 teenagers in her house, relatives and indentured servants and others, made a flag that was 30 by 42 feet. So much so that later they had to move the operation to the floor of a brewery, because it was only building large enough for them to be able to work on it. And they made this flag, and they made it in record time, and it was at that moment the largest flag in the United States. And on September 11th, the British fleet was finally seen offshore. 4,000 British troops landed. They began marching on the city. The Maryland State Militia, under General John Stricker, was there to face them. The British would have crushed the American force. The American force was a state militia, inexperienced, untrained. So the only thing that Stricker could think of that might tip the balance is just to surprise them, surprise the British. And he told them to attack, to just go with it. It's like throwing a Hail Mary pass or something, and they did. And I don't know if it would have worked in the long run had things not happened, but luckily for the United States, General Ross from the British side decided to ride up to the front lines. And he was a great general, beloved by his troops, competent, sharp, best commander they had. And an ordinary American sharpshooter from a tree shot him dead. Shot him dead, right off his horse. And the people who succeeded him as commander simply weren't up to the task. So the British troops ended up being very poorly led and made a number of mistakes and eventually retreated. Later, the Americans are going to retreat back to the city, right behind those barricades that they had built along with a lot of volunteers. And later, during the nighttime battle at Fort McHenry, they're going to hold the British off at Hampstead Hill. So there were land battles. A lot of times we don't hear about the land battles during this war, but they were very important. Meanwhile, at Fort McHenry on the morning of the 13th, the British begin their bombardment. An unceasing bombardment that's going to last 25 hours of constant shelling. And of course with the Americans shooting back from Fort McHenry with the British ships. It felt as if the city of Baltimore was experiencing a 25-hour earthquake. Every building shook to its foundations. Meanwhile, on a ship a few miles behind the first line of British ships, there was a 35-year-old American lawyer, Francis Scott Key. Again, another irony. You know, Key was not a military guy. Key had actually been against the war, and I should point that out. This was a war that was very deeply opposed by many Americans, especially in New England, right, but all over as well. And, you know, Key just wasn't, you know, a war guy, but he'd gone out to the British ships on an American truce vessel to negotiate the release of a friend of his who'd been captured by the British, so he was just there as a lawyer. He's there when the shelling starts, and he can't leave, so he literally gets stuck here on a ship watching this battle. Anyhow, the battle's going to, you know, all the while, by the way, the storm flag, the smaller flag, was flying over Fort McHenry. During the nighttime bombing, there was another miracle. A large British bomb landed in the main powder magazine of Fort McHenry, which had 250,000 pounds of gunpowder. And that was one of the ones that didn't explode. And it was a dud. Had that not been a dud, who knows what would have happened. But certainly most of the people in the fort would have died, and the British probably would have taken Baltimore. Anyway, the bombing continued throughout the night. Baltimore was completely blacked out. The only light that could be seen were the blades from the rockets and the bomb blast. So the only thing giving any light were flashes of intermittent light during this bombing. And everybody understood that if Fort McHenry fell and the British took Baltimore, the British would have a foothold, and Lord knows what would happen after that. There was some people who still didn't accept the loss of the North American colonies. Anyway, Francis Scott Key, you know, watched with anxiety, pacing up and down, trying to get glimpses of the fort when there were explosions, and could see very little. Early the next morning, after 25 hours, the bombing stopped. Silence fell over the harbor. Smoke covered it all. And the British ships started to move. And Major Armistead at Fort McHenry knew what it meant. It meant the British were giving up. They were retreating. So Armistead at that point orders the large 30 by 42-foot flag to be taken out and hoisted up so that the British could see it very clearly. And this largest flag in the United States, as the British were evacuating, was put up over Fort McHenry.
Yeah.
And Francis Scott Key, who previously had been opposed to the war, you know, was waiting anxiously to see who won. And there was nothing. There was morning mist, there was smoke, there was everything. And then he sees the British ships leaving. And then he sees this gigantic flag. Yeah. And he was just awed. He was just bowled over by it. And of course he was so inspired that he took out, you know, paper and pen and began to write verses. Verses which he finished later in the city of Baltimore. I remember I went to Fort McHenry, must have been 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a very, very humid August afternoon, and there's a museum there, which we got in right before they closed, and it's one of these neat interactive museums, but you know, once you're in a museum, you don't know which way you're going, and you know, there's not much, you know, that you can see outside or what direction. They had a little theater there, right, and they're going to show movies, so oh great, so we all sat down, and it wasn't like theater seating, it was like, you know, benches facing different directions. I guess the architect wanted to get creative. So we sat, it was one of these wonderful historical recreations that you see on the History Channel type thing. And then, you know, you're watching this huge screen that goes all across this wall. You know, maybe about maybe 6, 7 feet on up to the ceiling was the screen. And it was very, very, very long. Right, so we're watching, and then it gets to the part, you know, when Key takes out his paper, and he starts writing, and then they start, you know, the narrator begins to recite the poem, and then all of a sudden, I've never seen anything like this, out of nowhere, completely unexpected, the screen just rolls up, like when you accidentally, you know, hit a shade, or you don't expect it to go up that fast. The whole thing went up, and behind it were windows. And you were looking directly at Fort McHenry with an American flag flying over it. And then they continued reciting the poem. And you're looking at what Key was looking at, and I'm just like, this is too cool. I've been to a lot of museums in my life. I mean, I've sat and looked at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and nothing has ever been as cool as that. It was just magnificent. I probably ruined your next trip to Fort McHenry now. You're going to be waiting for the screen to go up. But if you listen to the poem, later, of course, we know it was set to the tune of a British drinking song. And then in the late 20s, Ripley's Believe It or Not, one of their Believe It or Nots was the United States does not have a national anthem. And everybody was kind of stumped, and they said, you're right. So John Philip Sousa, the famous patriotic composer, wrote a letter saying that he believed, along with a lot of other people, that the Star-Spangled Banner, or this defense of Fort McHenry, should become the national anthem. It was already being used in the military since the late 1800s, and in World War I it got more popular, etc. And finally, President Hoover in 1931 signed a declaration making it the national anthem. So I'm going to read. Now you'll notice every line, or I should say every stanza here ends, or the land of the free, the home of the brave. Okay, and most people don't know, but most of the first part are questions, right? They're not statements. We think it as if they were statements, but they're actually questions, right? And again, what are they? And I find a lot of students don't know this, so I explain it, even though most of us, who are of a certain age do understand it. What you're hearing at first, and what you're seeing at the baseball game, is what Francis Scott Key was seeing, right? Even the first line, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light." In other words, when he woke up in the morning, when he looked out in the morning, in the dawn's early light, what does he see? What so proudly they hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, what they saw the night before when the sun went down was still there, right? But they're mostly questions. They'll say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave, or the land of the free, and the home of the brave? On the shore dimly seen through the mist of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, O long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out the foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge can save the airman and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave. Or thus be it ever, when freemen shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us as a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God do we trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave. Yeah. Anyway, so just to wrap up the war, Robert Remedy, the famous Jackson historian, and then by the way, the war continued. Peace negotiations started soon after this, and like I said, peace negotiations were concluded. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson is involved in another spectacular upset victory over the British outside New Orleans, which is definitely the biggest victory of the war. Nobody in New Orleans knew that the peace treaty had been signed in Belgium, and it just set off this incredible wave of patriotism across the country. People weren't sure in the United States if they should be patriotic, especially those more concerned with states' rights. Those more concerned with states' rights were more hesitant because they didn't want to lose their autonomy. And, let's have and there was a lot of tension over this, but all hesitation came off in this wave of patriotism. Robert Remedy, like I said, he died last year. He's a Major Jackson scholar. He said, quote, "This was the moment we needed to prove we had a right to exist." And all the tests that I outlined earlier were passed. The new generation proved itself worthy. Successors to the Founding Fathers. This was the first generation after the Founding Fathers. It showed that independence was not a historical accident or a historical fluke. Yes, the form of government survived and in fact spread to many parts of the world, as we know, within a century and a half. Yes, the United States prevailed over all territorial threats. In fact, I believe, and I should be able to say this more definitely than a historian, but to my knowledge, it's the last time that a foreign soldier has set foot in the United States. I don't think any part of the United States has been occupied by a foreign power since this moment. And yes, the American people united and really began to view themselves as Americans. So let's enjoy this day. Again, I ask my colleagues here to forgive any sentimentality on my part over this, but like Judith said, my own family came here in 1960, fled a horrible, tyranny that was consuming their country, which had at one time been very close to the United States. My wife, fled in 1980 and nearly died coming, and was rescued by a group of Coast Guard members. But let's enjoy this day, this poem, this anthem, celebrate our national unity, which, people always think that we're so divided, but we've been divided for much of our history, but somehow we always pull together when we need to. And honor those who secured this nation for the future generations, and even for the families of people who weren't here in 1814. And let's honor that and honor our country and honor our freedom. Thank you very much.